Sometimes it is difficult listening to snippets from the New Testament, especially from the Gospels, and try to get a good context as to what's really going on in the Gospels at that time. So we have been reading in this liturgical year from the Gospel of Matthew, and maybe we can put the story into some context today and place the parable that we just heard within that context. So here's what's going on with Jesus in Matthew chapter 21. It begins with his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and then he overturns the money changers' tables. He heals the blind and the lame in front of the religious leaders. He goes to Bethany to spend the night and returns to the temple area. He debates the religious authorities with his teaching authority. And then in last week's parable, we heard about the two sons, the obedient one and the disobedient one. Jesus challenged the religious leaders of his time, and tax collectors and prostitutes, he said, are going into the kingdom of God before you. Imagine them hearing that. Imagine us hearing that from Jesus. And then, in today's parable, we heard the troubles of the owner of the vineyard. Now, the religious leaders must have known, they had to have known, that first reading from Isaiah. And that is the context of today's parable by Jesus. And it's an allegory, as it were. It's taking spiritual and abstract truths and making them more concrete so that people could really apply them to their own lives. The owner is the Lord. The vineyard is the realm of God, the kingdom of God, as it were. The tenants in this parable are the religious leaders, and they may be us too. We always enter into these stories. And those sent by the owner back to the tenants are the prophets, those who speak God's truth. That's the true meaning of a biblical prophet, those who speak God's truth. And even in our own time, they're killed for it. And there's a number of challenges in this gospel. Challenges to religious leadership. As tenants in the vineyard, they became proud possessors of authority. They held onto it tightly rather than being humble servants. They became owners of the tradition rather than the guardians of the tradition. They became those whose positions of power and privilege made them immune from criticism. That's the danger of being on the top of the heap. You don't want to hear those things because they challenge your position. The second challenge is to us as church, the people of God, because the church is first, foremost, and fundamentally the people of God. That's one of the great teachings of the Second Vatican Council. God sends you and me into the vineyard, into our own vineyard, into that small plot of land that you and I are given to cultivate and to tend so that it might produce some fruits within the kingdom of God. And that's really our mission as we leave here today. Go in peace, to love and serve the Lord and one another, to bring about the kingdom of God, maybe in some little way, but it still advances God's kingdom in our time. We are called to go through those doors, to produce the fruits of peace and nonviolence, to produce the fruits of joy and justice, God's justice. We are called to produce the fruits of gratitude and compassion, the fruits of reconciliation and forgiveness. God provides us with the tools. It's called wisdom. He provides us with the circumstances, the opportunities, provides us with the strength to produce fruit. And there's a name for that. It's called grace. God gives us the grace. It's always available to us. Many times we don't avail ourselves of it. But God's grace is always there for us. Our job is to provide the willpower. Will we do that? Will you and I make a difference in our world in some fashion? What fruit will you be called to cultivate this week and next week? What fruit will I be called to cultivate this week and next week? The produce of the kingdom of God is not going to happen by chance. Just think of a garden. When you don't tend your garden, what happens? Yeah, it's overcome by weeds. Absolutely. It goes to seed if we don't tend the garden. You and I have been called to tend the garden, called the kingdom of God. We're called to plant, to tend, and to harvest. But there's dangers in that. Did you notice that the tenants wanted it all? They weren't tenants anymore. They wanted it all. They wanted the name tag owner. And we need to guard against that danger. Let me just close with a story from one of my favorite authors. His name is, John Shea. And John Shea tells the story of the water of life. And in listening to this story, see if you can't see this circumstance in our world today. Because we try to own God sometimes, rather than allowing God to own us. So the water of life, wishing to make itself known on the face of the earth, bubbled up from an artesian well and flowed without limit. And people came to drink of this refreshing water, and they were nourished by it, since it was so clean and invigorating. But humankind was not content to leave things in this idyllic state in which we all shared. And gradually, they began to fence the well, put a fence around it. They charged admission. They claimed ownership of the property around it. They made elaborate laws as to who could and could not come to the well. And they put locks on the gates. And soon, the well was the property of the powerful and the elite. The water was angry and offended, and it stopped flowing and began to bubble up in another place. And the people who owned that property around that well were so engrossed in the power system they had developed and in their ownership that they didn't notice that the water of life had vanished. They continued selling non-existent water, and few people noticed that true power was gone. But some dissatisfied people searched with great courage and found a new artesian well, and soon that well was under the control of the property owners, and the same fate overtook it. The spring took itself to yet another place, and this has been going on throughout history. We do not own the vineyard. We work in it. And when we want it all, when we try to own it, we inherit nothing.